The Baltimore Ravens officially tagged Justin Madubuike on Tuesday, but how can they be players in free agency even if they don't reach an extension by free agency's start? We talk about that and so much more come up next year on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens. We are your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Ostreicher, Ravens Wire, and we're here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. As always, thanks so much for being here with us and making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every day here today on this Wednesday. We are free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube and audio form wherever you get your shows. Be sure to subscribe, follow along, like the video, the whole 9 yards. Really appreciate all the support. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $150 in bonus bets with that $1,500 bet. There's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. The news officially dropped yesterday. The Ravens franchise tagging Justin Madubuike. That's a 1 year, $22.1 fully guaranteed deal on the books. Here to talk about everything from the tag to how the Ravens can maneuver around it if there's no extension reached before free agency is Brian McFarland, Ravens salary cap of Russell Street Report. And Brian, 3 straight weeks here, a bunch of salary cap news on Locked On Ravens. Appreciate you giving me some time here again today. This was a big one. I think everybody kind of anticipated this was where it was headed. I know there was some hope an extension could have gotten done, but franchise tag, the official move from Madubuike here.
Yeah, as you said, it's not a surprise. We always would hope it would, they could get something done, would make it a little easier on this year's cap and obviously secure him for future years. But this is kind of the way. I mean, if you think about it, all the names that were talked about being tagged around the league, Mike Evans, I think, was the only one that actually signed a deal instead of being tagged. There were some guys that, there was some talk whether they would be tagged or not, they weren't. But as far as guys that were expected to be tagged, he was pretty much the only one. And I think there were about 10 guys that were tagged. I didn't look at the final number, but so it's not a surprise. They have, ideally they would get a deal done before next Tuesday or next Wednesday. I'm sorry, in order to make a little more cap space, make things a little easier. But they do have till July 15th to reach an extension. If they don't by then he has to play under the 1 year, $22.102 million cap or tag. And a lot of times that's the drop dead date, really. I mean, this isn't. That's the one that if they don't get it done then they're not. But that's something to keep an eye on. But hopefully they get something done before then.
Yeah, and you mentioned, July 15th is that absolute hard deadline. But I feel like for a lot of people, and especially on social media, Brian, everybody wants it done before free agency starts. You talked about on Wednesday there. And look, rightfully so. You get a lot of that money freed up, and I'm sure the Ravens would make that deal backloaded in a sense so they would have the money to spend this offseason. But if they don't get it done, if Madubuike is still on the tag by the time Wednesday rolls around or next Wednesday rolls around, what's kind of your panic meter in terms of how much the Ravens could actually get done and how much that would actually impact Baltimore's plans? Because, again, it'd be nice to have that chunk of change come Wednesday.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously several variables, but I think the first two right off the top moves that are easy and it gets them under the cap by next Wednesday would be releasing Tyus Bowser. That's $5.5 million. I mean, that's been talked about since September, really. That strange situation. So that's $5.5 million, and then restructuring Lamar's deal would create 11.1. So that by itself actually would get them pretty much under the cap. Bowser would give him a little more breathing room. So I think those are two moves we can definitely expect over the next week. And then beyond that, the tackle situation, whether Stanley gets a pay cut, or whether, and I think he and Moses might be tied together. If I don't think they both will go. So if they do end up releasing Stanley, then I think that saves Moses. If they get Stanley back at a pay cut, a lesser rate, I guess it depends on how much of a lesser rate that is, whether that saves Moses or not. So, and then there's some restructures. Mark Andrews, Roquan Smith, Marcus Williams. Between the three, I think it was around 17 million they can save. So they certainly have avenues, but they also have future cap expenses, the draft class. Once we get to September, practice squad, injury replacements, things like that. Those generally take up about 15 million. So, if all of a sudden, by next Wednesday they have 15 million extra, that doesn't mean they have 15 million to sign free agents with. That just gets them above water for the future. And then Stanley's going to be I think Stanley's the real big domino. He has a $4 million roster bonus due the fifth day of the league year. If they're not going to keep him around, then they're going to cut him before that. There's no sense in paying the $4 million and then cutting him. So, so that's probably as far as getting under the cap by the 13th, and then the next day, basically, getting him off the roster or staying on the roster, and then figuring out what's happened. If he is still in the roster, something has happened, I would have to think. It's just a matter of how soon it will be, announced or become public.
Yeah, I don't expect him to play on it. The cap hit right now is 26.1, around 26.1 million. I don't expect him to play on that full charge next season. What would you do there, though, Brian, knowing now we officially know Madubuike's been tagged, no guarantee the extension gets done? Would you just cut bait altogether, or would you approach him for a restructure and maybe try to get half of that 15 million cap hit back, or 2/3 of it?
Yeah, I think that's probably the approach they're going to take. Obviously, he's had an up and down. If he can get himself healthy, I think he's at least serviceable or better than serviceable. I don't think he's ever going to be all pro like he was before the injury. But at this point, he's due 15 million in cash, 11 million in salary, and then again that $4 million roster bonus. He's not getting 15 million in cash anywhere this year. Between signing bonus and salary, nobody's giving. He's going to have to play on a 1-year deal. He's got to prove he's healthy, and then teams will look at him, for maybe a bigger deal the following year. So I think that's the Ravens' approach. Look, we need to make this work for both of us, but we need to cut that 15 million in cash down. And we think on the market you're going to get no more than 8. So we'll give you 10 and incentives. So that reduces it by 5 million. Is that enough for their taste? Obviously, remains to be seen. But if they can get that down, that number down 5 to 7 million, I think it's worth keeping him, especially given the amount of dead money that they can, they can push off a little further if he's here next year. So, or if they cut him next year as opposed to this year, I should say. So I think that's probably the best result there. It just remains to be seen. And like I said, their leverage is, look, out on the market, you're not going to get this. So, we're going to make it, so you can get more than you would somewhere else, but, reduce that 15 million.
Right. And it makes sense. And he's the big fish in terms of how much money they can potentially save. Now, there are a couple other options for restructures and potentially even cuts, Brian. But again, you're not going to go and cut Justice Hill for savings right now. If you're the Ravens, you need him on the roster.
Sure.
It would save you a couple million. The only two that I think people have made slight cases for are Patrick McCary, who I personally wouldn't touch that contract. I'd keep him on the roster. And then Patrick Ricard, who it's questionable what his role is going to be next year. We kind of had this conversation last offseason about, well, how much of his role is he going to actually have and retain in year 2 now of Todd Monken's offense? Do you see either of those guys being released, or do you expect them to be on Baltimore's roster?
There's always one you don't expect. It seems like, every couple of years it's out of the blue and you're like, wow, didn't see that coming. But I agree. Macari's not that expensive. Now, he's not a starter either. He's paying probably more than a starter, but he's a great insurance policy. And let's face it. If Ronnie Stanley goes, Macari right now would be the starting left tackle,
right?
And until they draft or acquire somebody. So I don't see that happening. I think Ricard's probably a more likely one, just because I think you said his role in Monken's offense was reduced. His snaps were down this year. although I think he's still a valuable guy, and I think they certainly see value in him. So question is, he was a guy. He was a defensive tackle. Can they find another one like that? I mean, they tried with Ben Mason, that didn't really work out. But can they find somebody like that who's just the battering ram for a lot cheaper? But I think he's also a possibility. He could be an extension kind of guy. He's still young enough. Tag 2 years on, take that, cut that $4 million in savings down to, $2 million, you save off the cap. And I think that's a good result for both sides. He gets more money. He gets a little more security for future years, and they get their cap savings, but also, again, they retain him for future years as well. So, to me, that would be the best result. But again, you're looking at what the player wants and what the player thinks he's worth and what the Ravens think he's worth. And, those two obviously don't always meet.
Yeah, they've tried with Ben Mason. You talked about it there. I guess they have him sort of like waiting in the wings in a sense. But if they feel like they're really desperate and they need that money, Ricard could certainly be an option. But I agree with you where McCary is just so valuable as a guy who can play all 5 positions. And while he's getting paid a little more than a typical backup would, I think the fact that he has that versatility is really valuable. Coming up in the second part of the show, we're going to be talking about how much of a player the Ravens can be in free agency with Madubuike on the tag versus off of it, and what the tag actually means for both Baltimore and Madubuike. All that and more come up next on the second segment of Locked On Ravens. First, this show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. There's $150 if your bet wins. There's no football anymore, but basketball's in full swing and baseball is coming up shortly here. But for me, I'm a big Denver Nuggets guy, so you can bet all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live stream game parlays, exclusive props, and so much more. So if you want to bet Nikola Jokic, Jamal Murray, or the Nuggets, they're a pretty safe team to bet on right now. At the time of this recording, they're 6-0. After the All-Star break, they're playing the Phoenix Suns tonight, so hopefully extending that to 7. This is FanDuel.com/lockedon to shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. We're back on our second segment, Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still talking with Brian McFarland. After the news, the Ravens officially franchise tag Justin Madubuike. And Brian, again, everybody wants this deal to be done before free agency starts. The franchise tag is there now. Having that 22.1 charge is a hefty one. And I think, again, we kind of went through the stance last offseason with Lamar on the tag, and he had his $32 million number on there until he signed the extension right up until the draft. But for Madubuike, it's a big offseason for Baltimore. And a lot of people want to see change and big signings and guys coming in from outside the organization. I think we have to remember a few things, though. One, the Ravens don't just – I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago when, like, the Patriots and Texans signed 15 free agents each on the first day of free agency. The Ravens don't operate that way. No. They like to go in, see what the market is for guys, and then kind of swoop in. But it is true that the status of Madubuike, whether it's an extension or a tag, does change how the Ravens would operate in free agency. So how big of players could the Ravens be this offseason in free agency with Madubuike on the tag versus off of it?
Yeah, I think they probably have one move, one medium-sized, a little above medium-sized, I guess. They're not going to be going out and signing another guy for $20 million a year. Obviously, that's Madubuike. They're probably not signing a guy who's going to make $15 million a year. Obviously, running back is the one spot that's been talked about like crazy. The free agent market is flush in running back, so that could push some values down to them a little bit. I don't think they're going to go, and obviously we'll see. But if Jacobs and Barkley are over $10 million a year, I don't on average, I don't see that happening. If they can get a Derrick Henry for, $6 to $7 to $8 million a year, then I think they could probably pull that off. They can use void years again if they decide to. We saw them do that last year when they didn't have a lot of cap space. They got Beckham on a, $15 million deal, and I think it was 3.25 was his cap number. So, if they want to use void years again, they can do that. So I think they do have that kind of move, but then I think most of the other moves are going to be, re-signing an Arthur Millette or a Ronald Darby, Brent Urban, which isn't going to cost much against the cap at all. Some of those kinds of moves for sure. And as you said, they're rarely, certainly on the first couple days of the free agency period, they're rarely inactive. Marcus Williams a couple years ago was pretty much the most the most recent one. But then they liked that second tier of guys, and they've obviously last year they did amazingly on second tier and third tier guys, and even guys obviously with Van Noy all the way into the season. So yeah, I wouldn't expect. And I'll think if they get Madubuike done, then they might have another medium-sized move available. But I'm not sure where that would be, but what position that would be. But obviously, if Stanley's going, are they going to rely on a rookie to start at left tackle? And that's obviously part of that equation as well. And of course, that's on his side too. What are you going to do? Draft a guy at 30? Maybe. Right. Is he going to start and be better than me? So that's something that we'll have to. And I don't think there's the free agent market. I don't think as much in tackles. The draft is huge in tackles, but. So that's that's where the pay cut would work for both sides, I think, very well.
Yeah, it's almost like flip-flop. The tackle class is incredible this year in the draft, but not so much in free agency. And running backs, you have this deep free agent class, but there aren't a lot of running backs in the draft that you feel confident, especially early on. It might not be a running back until very middle of day 2 type deal with that class right now. But when you say medium-sized move, does that mean from outside the organization, or is that like a Jadeveon Clowney to you, where they re-sign him, they bring back Darby, and that's a reality where maybe they work around the edges with outside guys, but they try to prioritize their own guys, and maybe that's what their offseason looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more of an outside guy, like a running back. Yeah. And Clowney will be an interesting free agency because obviously they got him for again, next to nothing. I mean, I think he was $2.25 million on the cap. He earned incentives to make it much, to make more in pay. But as far as the cap went last year, when they signed him, it was pretty cheap. It's not going to be that. I think he's looking in the 7 to 8 to 9 million range, probably still a 1-year deal. And that's where they could use void years. And that might be one where, if you're judicious with void years, then I don't think they're going to use it as much as they did last year. But on a guy like that, we really want him back, and we know that number is going to be higher than we can afford on our cap. Then we'll use as they kind of like they did with OBJ last year on a bigger deal, use those void years and bring that down. So I could see that on 1 or 2 guys, but I don't think they're going to go full scale like they did last year.
Now, an interesting position, I don't think we've talked about it, we maybe touched on it very briefly a couple episodes ago, Brian, was the wide receiver position. We've seen that market, I guess, kind of dry up relatively in terms of the big names. Mike Evans goes back to Tampa. On his deal, he got Michael Pittman and T. Higgins, both franchise tagged. But Calvin Ridley is a name that a lot of people are intrigued by. Obviously, many wanted him to come to Baltimore in that 2018 draft when the Ravens took Hayden Hurst. Now, he's a free agent coming from Jacksonville. They're going to kind of more so leaning like he's going to explore the market. Wide receivers are premium position. You can even look at other guys like Marquise Brown, where I know some people have kind of fantasized about what it would be like if Marquise came back to Baltimore. Do you expect them to go after some of the higher tier wide receivers in this class, or would you expect them to maybe try to get another guy in the earlier rounds on a rookie deal? Because the wide receiver contracts, we're seeing them, like other positions, continuing to go up and up every single season.
Yeah, I think they're more likely to draft someone. I could see them bringing in another veteran, but it's going to be more of a Nelson Aguilar type, But I could see with those, with those first 3 picks, the first 3 rounds, I could see them going wide, getting a wide receiver. Since it is a deep draft, you can get, a guy who might have gone in the 2nd in prior years. You get him in the 3rd. So I think that's probably, that's what DaCosta was trying to do from the beginning with all, he's drafted more, hot wide receivers in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd rounds than Ozzie did probably in his whole, in DaCosta's 5 years versus Ozzie's, 22 or whatever it was. So, I think that's probably more likely, a guy like OBJ, if he's still out there on the market after the draft, and if the draft doesn't go the way the Ravens wanted, and obviously that means OBJ wasn't getting the offers he wanted, I could see a reunion there. But I think that one's kind of a back burner kind of situation, and they'll let the market play out and see, and that's sometimes, he got 15 million here last year. It's kind of tough to say, okay, well, I'll come back for 3, I'll go somewhere else for 3. because I'm taking a pay cut, but I'm not taking a pay cut from you, and it's kind of a weird, but it's, their history says that is a very common situation, and the guys generally don't re-sign, when they're taking such a huge cut.
Right. It's a big amount of money to, I guess the word is sacrifice, but it's just, you're on that team and then the contract for next year is so much smaller than what you got there. So essentially, like, the Ravens have been linked to Michael Thomas. So you may be anticipating something like along those lines, like a veteran wideout. I guess you don't like the move based off your reaction there.
We've had so much injury problems with wide receivers. And I mean, obviously when he was in his prime, he was amazing. And I guess, the idea is you can get him for cheap. And, if they draft a guy the plan is to draft a guy in the first 3 rounds and you bring him in and you've got, sufficient depth, so to speak, with Aguilar and Bateman and Zay Flowers and got Wallace there too. Maybe that makes some sense. And he's not going to get, he's not going anywhere near the top of the market either with his injury history. So, I mean, maybe that's the philosophy. I can see that. Not sure I agree with that, but because obviously you get to the draft and the draft goes a direction you didn't expect, and now you're drafting a wide receiver in the 5th round instead, and now it doesn't feel, and now you've all those top guys, like I said, a guy who could get in the 3rd who was a 2nd, now you're getting a guy who's in the 5th because he belongs in the 5th, and that maybe that's then it doesn't work out so well, and then you really got your fingers crossed that Thomas stays healthy.
Yeah, it's even, you can go back to 2022 when Kyle Hamilton fell into the Ravens' lap. The reason that happened is because there was a run on like 5 straight wide receivers leading up to the Hamilton pick, or essentially. It wasn't exactly 5. Jordan Davis went right before, but it was Drake London and Jameson Williams and Garrett Wilson and all these guys that went. So you could maybe think the Ravens were probably thinking one of these guys is definitely going to fall to us, right? And then they all go in a span of like 5 picks. So I agree. The draft, and honestly, free agency too, can be such a fickle thing. You have to have plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. You have all these different plans. So we're going to see how Baltimore does it. But coming up in the final part of the show, we're going to be talking a bit more about what the extension could look like for Justin Madubuike and how we could potentially time it up based off the other free agent defensive linemen on the market. Stay tuned. A lot to get to on Locked On Ravens. First, this show is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors is everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts, your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. All the parts you know, the prices you want. It's easy to turn a car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. We are back here with Brian McFarland. I am Kevin Ostreicher on this midweek edition of Locked On Ravens. Thanks so much for being here today and making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every day. Be sure to subscribe in video form and audio forms for 5 days a week of Ravens content, plus other bonus content as well. Brian, with the franchise tag, we went through it with Lamar last offseason and him, the non-exclusive negotiating. And I think some people with Madubuike are seeing in this, oh, well, it's non-exclusive. He can negotiate with other teams. Does that mean he's actually secure in Baltimore in 2024? I think this is a little different than the Lamar situation. I think even though it's the quote-unquote non-exclusive tag, the fact that they did it does mean that he's going to be in Baltimore in 2024. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yeah. It's as much as, we love him and other teams would love to have him. Nobody's giving up 2 first-round picks. I mean, the history of even the non-exclusive tag. I mean, the exclusive tag is really for your quarterbacks, essentially, or a guy like Khalil Mack when he was in his prime. Those kinds of situations. Aaron Donald. Those kind of guys. I mean, top the market kind of guys. Everybody else, I mean, in the history of the tag, I think only once. So I'm not worried about that. He's going to be here at least for next year and hopefully beyond that.
And for Baltimore, with this potential extension for Madubuike, I think that's where I want to go next year, Brian, because that's the goal. That's the ideal situation for Baltimore right now. But what do you think that could look like? Obviously, I think just generally it's a back-end or back-loaded deal. You talk about the first couple of years, that salary cap, and having it be a lower cap hit in those first couple of seasons. But how would you approach from both Madubuike's side and the Ravens side of trying to get a deal done? And what could it look like?
Yeah, I mean, the big variables there now will be what happens with Chris Jones and what happens with Wilkins, because those are the top two interior guys. And that's going to be, if they, so I'm just calling Madubuike in the 22 million a year range, maybe a little higher. But if obviously Jones is going real high, and I don't think that really affects. I was going to say Lamar because I'm used to Lamar being on the side. Affects Madubuike, but I do think Wilkins very much could. So that's where they, and I agree. I think they'll come up with a cap number that first year, in the 10 to 12 range. It saves them 8 to 10. Or more, depending upon where exactly falls for this year. And then, that last, whether it's a 5-year or 6-year deal, that last year will be one of those, astronomical numbers that he's never going to see one way or another. And whether that means because they get an extension before that, or if he gets cut then, or, at that point. So I think, it's just a question. And again, I think Wilkins is going to be, Wilkins being on the market is probably not helpful for the Ravens. It's helpful for Madubuike because, he goes out and gets $25 million a year. Then Madubuike is like, well, okay, my price is set. I want $25 million and $1, So that's where I would say that would go.
Do you expect Madubuike to kind of time this up where he kind of waits out Jones and waits out Wilkins to see what they get, and then even tries to maybe top them or get right in the middle of what Wilkins and Jones gets? Or do you think that there is a chance that he's the first one and essentially, quote unquote, like resets the market himself?
Yeah, I mean, that's the dilemma for the Ravens is, the longer they wait, and obviously they couldn't reach a number as of today, yesterday, but that's going to be, that's their dilemma is how do we get to that point, and how do we make him happy and keep him off the market, but also keep it, as low as possible when we're talking $20+ million, per year.
I think, it's weird because, and we were even talking about this with Lamar, where with every quarterback extension that got signed before him, that was only increasing the price. And I know the quarterback situation is different than pretty much any other position, but Madubuike is so valuable to them. They had to find a way to at least just keep him in Baltimore, and whether it is the franchise tag for this year or the extension, either way, it means he's going to be on the field for them in 2024. Right. But what do you think the percentage is, if you had to just throw a number on it, that they get a deal done before the actual July 15th deadline, that he's going to be playing on an extension come week 1? Or do you feel like this could really drag out and he's playing on the 1-year deal in 2024?
No, I think they'll get something done. It's always been, I think the only time 2 players have been tagged twice, Terrell Suggs, so obviously they didn't get it done then, and Chris McAllister, I think, was the other. So, and they got that done the second year with the tag, and they got both of those done pretty quickly. So, I think they'll get something done. But again, if Wilkins blows them out of the water, if they're we have our line and we can't go over 23 million and Wilkins gets 25, that may make it difficult.
Now, how confident are you in the defensive line room long term, especially when you talk about you have Madubuike, Broderick Washington, and Travis Jones? Obviously, Michael Pierce is not a long-term option there. Brent Urban's a free agent, but they have 3 really quality young defensive linemen in that room. And I mean, if Travis Jones has kind of a breakout next season, maybe some people are thinking that can be the case. There's potential that they could have, again, a really nice, solid foundation of young guys in that room.
Yeah, I think so. And, they'll probably, they have 8 draft picks. So, they might use a, 5th or a 7th on another guy. They've been pretty good. I mean, Broderick Washington was a 5th round pick. So they Kelly Gregg was off the street. Lionel Dalton, going back, showing my age, he was an undrafted free agent. So, so they've been good at getting guys like that. So, I think they'll add, but obviously not a big guy, big. I mean, their big guy again is Madubuike.
Yeah. And I guess in terms of what your expectations are now moving forward, because he had the breakout year, 13 sacks. We've talked about how valuable interior pass rush is. What are your expectations moving forward for Madubuike? He's going to be on a deal of some sort. It's going to be a big money contract, whether it is 1 year or a multi-year extension. What are you expecting from him moving forward in his career?
Yeah, I mean, I think he's just, I think he's honestly just kind of scratching the surface. And maybe that's rose-colored glasses, but everything you hear about him is he's a hard worker. Obviously, money changes people, but he's a hard worker. He puts in film study, all those kinds of things. So I mean, I'm not saying he's going to have 13 and a half sacks every year, but if he's an 8+ sack guy a year for the 5 years of the contract, then I think it's a pretty solid, it's a pretty solid signing. You'd like him to get over 8 here and there, but if no less than 8 a year, how about say it that way? Then I think it's a solid signing for sure.
Yeah, I think you get value there if it's an 8+ guy for 5 seasons. You're taking that 10 times out of 10. And I don't know. I don't think money's going to change Madubuike. I think he's going to be a hard worker here, regardless, 100%. But I think SproTrack has the projection for Madubuike's contract, the extension, right around 4 years, $81.3 million. Does that line up for you?
I think it's a little low. I think Pro Football Focus does a lot of really good stuff, and I think they have him more in the 22 to 23, and I think that's probably where he belongs.
Yeah, I don't know if he's going to scratch 25. I mean, again, we'll see what Jones and Wilkins get, and if he's the first one or if he waits those guys out. A lot of different variables, as you talked about, for sure. But Brian, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for hopping on. Please, again, tell people where they can find you and what you're working on. It's crazy to think we're less than 1 week from the tampering period here.
Yeah, crazy. So this is my time of the year. You can find me on Twitter at Raven or X at Raven Salary Cap, and then all of my work is on RussellStreetReport.com. We have a free agency, putting a couple heads together of our writers. That should come out Friday, I think. And then obviously as contracts start happening, as soon as we get numbers, I put it together and we'll get the information out as quickly as we can and break it down.
Those links all in the description below. Be sure to check out Brian's work. He does great work all the time. Brian, I appreciate you again. Thanks so much. And thank you for tuning into Locked On Ravens today. Again, be sure to subscribe, follow along, video form and audio form, the whole 9 yards. Coming up tomorrow, more Ravens content. So be sure to stay tuned. I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.